You know, Barry, to me, one thing I've said is the great Western disease is I'll be happy when. It's followed by get the money, get the status, get the BMW, blah, 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 blah. And to me, what I love about what you're saying, or one of the things I love about what you're saying, is really attacking that I'll be happy when. We have been programmed from birth by watching commercials. People like Martin, these marketing people, do this to us all the time. You know, you'll be happy when you buy the product. You'll be happy when you get the car, whatever. I love your thoughts on this. What led us into this wacky I'll be happy when nonsense anyway, and point out some strategies to get around this.
Sure. Well, this is, as I'm sure you know, a very big question. And I think there are two dimensions to it. One is that there's a kind of obsession with materialist consumption, right? We live in a consumer society. And what that means is that happiness is about the next thing we get, whatever that might be. And God forbid you're satisfied with what you have, because then you stop shopping. And so there's this whole complex set up to make sure that no matter what we have, there's something dangling in front of us that we don't yet have that'll make us happier. So I think it should be much less about what you have and much more about what you do. And it's often, there's often a trade that people make. They focus much less on what they do and much more on what they have. And that's a sucker's game. That's a game where you're basically always chasing your tail. And it is not a recipe for happiness. It's a recipe for dissatisfaction.
Barry Scott Simon was one quoted on NPR saying that rules and procedures may be dumb, but they spare you from thinking. And I think both you and I have something in common, that we wrote a book, you're about wisdom and I'm about common sense. Now, you once said, when we tap into rules, they may work in the short run, but create a downward spiral that makes them all feel worse on the long run. All reliance of rules deprives us from improvisation. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I very much admire Nat's incredible experiment. I don't think I could do it for 5 minutes, but there has to be something between rigid, rule-governed social structures on the one hand and randomness on the other. And what I argue with my collaborator in the book Practical Wisdom, and what I argued in talking about the limits of rules, is that there needs to be room for flexibility and improvisation. I think that because of the extraordinary uncertain nature of the human environment and other people, we need to be essentially to go through the world like jazz musicians. There are notes on the page, and the musicians can play the notes. But what makes it jazz is not that they play the notes on the page, but how they improvise around the notes on the page. And as a teacher, every time I go into a classroom, every time I interact with a particular student, the question is, does this student need tough love or kindness from me? Does this student need me to be extraordinarily detailed in my criticism, or does the student need encouragement? And I didn't know how to answer these questions when I started teaching. I've now been doing it for 50 years, and I've gotten better at reading what each student needs. And so I do a little dance with the student as I get to know the student to try to figure out what the sweet spot is, so that I can be both useful, instructive, and informative, but also encouraging. And I think the same thing is true when you're raising your kids. You have your first kid and you go, oh, this is easy. Any parent who ever says that is nuts. And then your next kid comes along and you do the same thing that you did with your first kid, but lo and behold, your next kid's completely different. And everything that worked well with the first kid is a disaster with the second kid. And so you need to appreciate that there's variability, not just noise, there's systematic variability. And our job is to be able to have enough freedom and flexibility and judgment to figure out what a particular situation with a particular person calls for. I think this is the secret to having good relations with other people. I think it's the secret to having a productive team in the workplace. I think it's the secret to having a good intimate relationship with your romantic partner. I don't know how you get through the day without wise judgment.
Fantastic. Okay, coming up, how randomness at work might be the secret source of improving employment satisfaction and with that productivity. Now, I need to ask you, Max, not everyone can live a crazy life like yours. What is your advice to the millions of people out there who feel trapped by this hamster wheel we talked about early on?
I really liked the conversation earlier about constraints and the fishbowl, and I think that one way that you can change your life is to change the constraints. Artists have known this for a long time, that like the work itself is actually a product of its constraints rather than just purely the vision of the artist. And so I think that if you could tweak your constraints somewhat, you could change. Limit the set of options that you have to one that's different than the one you had before. That can push you into a different direction.
Very interesting stuff. One of the things I think really, Max, that I've thought about when looking at what you're doing is we are being pushed toward conformity within a subgroup. So, for example, if you look at online, everything is geared, though he likes this, give him that. He likes this, she likes this, give him that. And all of a sudden, everything we see is programmed to be stuff that the computer thinks we're going to like. Then pretty soon we get a very warped view of the world. So I love what you're doing just to break out of that box a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the social media companies have sort of bought onto an incorrect view of who we are, because we're not defined by our preferences or the things that we've done before. We have the ability to change and to try things that are outside of what we've liked before. And so I think part of what I'm trying to communicate is that we should think about how could we live our lives outside of this small conception of ourself. Yeah.
Now, listen, Yuval Noah Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, talks about the life hacking and how algorithms and AI increasingly know more about ourselves than we do, right? He uses an example, I remember, of an algorithm detecting if a young person is gay before they even themselves know, based on eye tracking. And thus it's nearly impossible for us to take control back. Tell me, Max, can you detach yourself from AI at all? Can you leave the grid as you've done, or is it just an artist do an experiment because you have an extraordinary will? Give me a sense of this, because it's just such an amazing thing you've done, but it just seems so unreal somehow.
I think that it's important to understand the way that these algorithms work. And one nice thing about randomizing is that it's sort of like putting up a mirror to an algorithm, in that you can see the algorithm trying to match to this random stimulus that you've given it. And I think that once you see the way that the algorithm works and the way that it's trying to put you into a box, then it kind of breaks the spell, because essentially it's like a magic trick where if you know the secret behind it, it doesn't have as much power. So that's why I encourage people to try adding some random noise into whatever they're feeding into the algorithm, and then see how that changes their feed.